Good evening and welcome to Alan's Italy. This show, number 130, will focus on the paintings of Raphael, the famous Italian Renaissance artist who did his work in Florence and Rome mostly, and the paintings are located at the Pitti Palace in Florence at the Galleria Palatina. Now, when I go to a museum, an art museum, I like to focus on a specific theme or a specific room or a specific artist. And, it's just some of these places are just so overwhelming that it's really very hard to, gather everything in. So I like to really narrow it down to a particular, very esoteric. And this is the only way that I personally can go to an art museum, because otherwise, I just cannot spend hour upon hour, looking at everything there is. It's just way too difficult. Two fast stories about this philosophy of looking at art. One is, I went to the Uffizi many, many years ago, and a friend of mine wanted me to show her around the gallery. Now, the Uffizi is a very easy gallery to go around because all the art is chronological. So it's easy to follow how the development of art occurred, starting with the 13th century going up, to, I'm not sure what, maybe the 17th or 18th century. So, we began and we, were going on for about 2 hours. After 2 hours, I said, well, it's time for lunch. So she said, great, let's go up to the cafe in the Uffizi, which is really nice because it overlooks the Piazza della Signoria, and it's really very nice. But I said, when I go to the Uffizi, I like to go to the Trattoria Alfredo, located on Via dei Neri, which is right behind the Uffizi. And she said, well, if we go out, we may not be able to come back in again. So I said, I'm finished. I've done 2 hours and I'm ready to go. And she said, well, I'm not. And she mentioned that when she'd gone to the Louvre, she'd been to the Louvre like the week before. She spent 6 hours there. I said, oh, that's just way too much for me. Can't do it. Recently, we went with my daughter and son-in-law and granddaughter to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan. And, they wanted to see everything. And, Laura and I said, look, you can't do that. You have to narrow it down to 2 or 3 parts of the gallery. And, we'll focus on that. And that's exactly what we did. So, I chose the Pitti Palace, the Galleria Palatina, the Palatine Gallery, and not even all of the Raphael art, which is, a lot of this. There's a lot of Raphael art at the Pitti Palace. I focused on just the ones that really have special meaning to me. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this show. So if you want to, if you think and those of you who know me know that I'm not an art historian, but I'm going to give you as much information as I can, but only about certain paintings. I have a very special feeling about certain paintings, and I'll tell you why I do as we move along. And then, and I'll go into a little background of why I have a really special interest in that. So that's what this show will focus on. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about the Pitti Palace and all the different things you could do at the Pitti Palace. There's a lot of different galleries. There's a lot of things to see. There's the Boboli Gardens. So it's, I'll do that a little bit. Then I'll talk about the Galleria Palatina in general. And then we'll focus on Raphael. We'll talk a little bit about his life, his career, a little biography of him. And then we'll focus on 2 or 3 or 4 pieces of work by him. And, I'll go into it in as much detail as I feel is necessary to get the point across of what I would like to talk about. So that's the way the show is going to look. And then we'll come back and I'll wrap it all up a little later on. So that's the plan for this show. Okay, so let's begin by talking about the Pitti Palace. And the core of this palace dates from the year 1458 and was originally owned and built, well, it was authorized to be built by a famous and very wealthy Florentine banker by the name of Luca Pitti. And rumor has it that he spent so much money on building this palazzo that he kind of made himself broke and couldn't afford to keep it, but he did, and it was later sold by his heirs to the Medici in the year 1549. The original Pitti Palace was nowhere near as large as we see it today, and you can see in this picture of the way it looked back in the 15th century that it was much smaller than it is today. Later generations amassed a lot of paintings and plates and jewelry and luxurious possessions. Napoleon used the Pitti Palace as his power base in the late 18th century when his troops had occupied Florence. And, later on, the palace and its contents were donated to the Italian people by King Emmanuel III, and this was in the year 1919. It is considered the largest museum complex in Florence and consists of many different parts, such as, for example, the royal apartments, the Gallery of Modern Art, the Silver Museum, Porcelain Museum, there's a costume gallery, there's a carriage museum, and of course, there is the amazing and spectacular Boboli Gardens that you see pictured right there. Laura and I had spent an entire afternoon at the Boboli Gardens climbing to the top and photographing it and getting some really spectacular views, two of which you see right there. And one of the galleries is, of course, the Palatine Gallery, which was created in 1828, and it is very different from the typical gallery, which has kind of, as I indicated earlier, for example, the Uffizi, which gives you a chronological survey of the art that's very easy to follow from room to room. I'm even thinking of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has its art kind of, broken up into periods, and the periods are each a different gallery. The Palatine Gallery gives the appearance of a private collection. The ceiling was painted by Pietro da Cortona. You see it right there, very, very beautiful. And it's, that's very, very spectacular. In the Palatine Gallery, of course, we have Raphael, but there are paintings by many, many very, very famous artists. So if you go to the Palatine Gallery, you can see work by Caravaggio, Bronzino, Filippo Lippi, Velázquez, Van Dyck, Rubens, Titian, Tintoretto, which is amazing. I mean, you go to this gallery and it's definitely doable in one afternoon or a morning. It's not overwhelming, so it's definitely a doable thing. The paintings are placed in a very, very random way. So there's no, you can't say, well, I'm going to do this or do that. And as you can see in these photographs, it kind of looks like a person's house where a person would just kind of acquire a piece and then hang it on the wall and try to fit as many pieces as possible, which is a good thing in a way. But on the other hand, I have always found this a very difficult museum to go around because, the paintings are from floor to ceiling. And it's almost difficult to see some of the ones at the very top. However, understanding all the limitations, it is a very, very worthwhile museum to go to, and I strongly, strongly recommend it. For a morning or an afternoon. So Raphael's real name is Raphael Sanzio da Urbino, meaning from Urbino, and he lived from 1483 to 1520. This is what you're looking at now is a self-portrait that he did of himself, but he became known simply as Raphael. Born in Urbino, which was a small but artistically significant town, made so by Federico III de Montefeltro, whose court was more of a literary than an artistic court. Raphael worked in his father's workshop. He was orphaned at the age of 11, but continued the workshop after his father's death. In Urbino, he came into contact with the works of Uccello, who was the previous court painter, and Luca Signorelli from a nearby town. According to Vasari, Raphael apprenticed for Pietro Perugino, who was a great artist at the time. Raphael came to Florence in 1504, and at the same time that he was in Florence, Leonardo da Vinci was also in Florence from 1500 to 1506. So Raphael became very influenced by the work of Leonardo da Vinci. In 1508, Raphael went to Rome, where he became associated with Julius II. Pope Julius II commissioned Raphael to paint what became known as the stanza di Raphael, meaning the Raphael rooms, which are actually located just above the Sistine Chapel. And in fact, Raphael was working on his magnificent work at the same time that Michelangelo was working on the Sistine ceiling. One of Raphael's most magnificent work is in the Raphael rooms. It is the School of Athens. And it's always been one of my favorite pieces of art. One of the great experiences I had was to go to the Ambrosiana Museum in Milan, which has the actual cartoon, which is the sketch that Raphael used to do the School of Athens. So that was a really great experience. When Julius II died and Leo X became Pope, Raphael developed a very close relationship with Leo X as well. Raphael's workshop eventually grew to 50 pupils and assistants. And Raphael, once he moved to Rome, just stayed there. And, he's known for many, many things. He was a wonderful portraitist, an architect, a printmaker. He's considered one of the finest draftsmen in the history of art, using drawings to plan his compositions. And, we're going to go over several of his work, as I indicated earlier. He died in the year 1520 at the age of 37, and his request was to be buried in the Pantheon of Rome. We're going to begin by talking about this portrait. This is a portrait that was done by Raphael in 1505 to 1506 of Agnolo Doni, who was a wealthy merchant in the wool industry in the early 16th century, in the early 1500s. And I first became aware of Agnolo when I read the book The Agony and the Ecstasy by Irving Stone. And Irving Stone tells the following story, that Doni had just gotten married to Maddalena Strozzi in 1503, and in around 1504, Doni wanted to present to his new wife a picture, a Holy Family, which is, usually a painting of the Virgin Mary, her husband Joseph, and the baby Jesus. And he went to the artist at the time, who was the most famous in Florence, who was Michelangelo. Michelangelo had just finished doing his David, and it was placed in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. So he was, he was the guy of the hour at that particular time. So Doni went to him to do the painting. Michelangelo presented this piece to him that you're now looking at, and he didn't like it. Doni didn't like it because it had nude figures in it. And this is, a devotional piece, a Holy Family. And he said to Michelangelo, "I don't want the piece." So Michelangelo, said, I don't know what the actual words are, but in the book, Irving Stone, kind of indicates that Michelangelo was disgusted and said, "Okay, forget about it." Well, Doni then spoke to a number of people, influential people at the time, who said, Michelangelo is becoming a famous artist, and it would be very good for you to go back to him and say, "Okay, I'll take it." Well, he did that, and Michelangelo raised the price. And Doni, who was a young merchant at the time, taking over his father's business, thought of himself in a very positive way as being able to, negotiate. And he kept going back and forth with Michelangelo, who kept raising the price until Doni bought the painting. And, that was one interpretation of that situation. Another one that I read recently was that, as you can see, Mary is in the foreground, looking very powerful, and Joseph is on top, kind of, leaning over. And as Joseph is leaning over, he's receiving the baby Jesus from Mary, who's kind of, lifting Jesus over her right shoulder so that Joseph can take the child. Kind of, in a way, transferring power from herself to Joseph. And this interpretation indicated that Doni was not really the person who commissioned the painting, but that the painting was commissioned by the Strozzi family, who wanted to give it to Agnolo Doni as a gift to kind of signify the fact that by marrying the daughter, Maddalena, that he was indeed, coming into a very well-known, established, noble family, wealthy family of Florence. And the baby Jesus kind of represents the power being transferred from the powerful Maddalena up to Joseph, who was kind of represented for Doni, who was, becoming coming into the Strozzi circle. So that's another story. Nobody knows, what's really true. But this is how the world sees Agnolo Doni, and you're now looking at a portrait of his wife, Maddalena Doni, which was painted by Raphael in 1506. And if you look at this painting of Maddalena, she is sitting in the pose that was pretty much well accepted at the time as a typical pose for a woman. But, when I saw this, I said, wow, Raphael, who was indeed influenced very much by Leonardo da Vinci, is using a lot of the same techniques that Leonardo used. For example, if you look at Maddalena, her hands are folded so that her right hand is over her left hand. And I said, wow, looks like the Mona Lisa, which you're now looking at. And you can see that the Mona Lisa indeed is sitting in exactly the same manner. Has a little smile on her face, as you can see, whereas Maddalena does not have a smile on her face, but they're sitting virtually the same, and their hands play a very prominent role. Leonardo's landscape is more well-defined and kind of draws your eye to it more than Raphael's of Maddalena, whose landscape is very sparse. And, Leonardo is using a technique known as sfumato, which is derived from the Italian word fumo, meaning smoke, and it creates a soft transition between colors and tones to create a more believable image. In Da Vinci's own words, it was a blending of colors in the manner of quote-unquote smoke. So this is a technique that Leonardo used that Raphael would use as well later on, which I'll show you in a couple of paintings. You're now looking at the painting, another painting in the Galleria Palatina by Raphael, known as La Velata, meaning the woman with a veil. And it was painted in 1516. And, when I saw this, I said, oh my God, she looks very similar to another painting that I've seen. And it turns out that it's the same woman as is depicted in Raphael's painting of La Fornarina, which you're now looking at. In a very similar pose, you could see her right arm, her right hand, is in close proximity to her breast. And, it turns out that this is no mistake. This is Raphael's Roman mistress, whose name was Margherita Luti. And La Fornarina was painted by Raphael just a couple of years later. So very, very similar poses. And again, very, very important in Raphael's life. The next painting you're looking at is of Tommaso Inghirami. It was painted in 1509 by Raphael. There's two copies of this. One is in the Gardner Museum in Boston. And stylistically, it's related to Agnolo Doni in terms of the intensity and clarity, or realism, the attention to detail. Tommaso Inghirami was a friend of Raphael, of high ranking, a member of the clergy. He was known as a very popular orator and actor. He had a disease known as strabismus, which is, kind of cross-eyed. Your eyes are kind of moving in different directions. And Raphael painted this with, it's evident that there's a lot of movement in it. kind of moving to the side to detract the viewer's gaze from the sitter's eyes to the actual movement. And nonetheless, it's pretty obvious. He's kind of looking up into the sky. This has been also very closely related to Agnolo Doni because of its intensity and its attention to detail. This piece is very similar to the works of Hans Holbein. And Raphael may have been influenced by him as well. The next piece we're looking at is known as La Donna Gravida. It was painted by Raphael between 1505 and 1506. And as you could very plainly see, it's the portrait of a pregnant woman, which is very unusual in the Renaissance period to depict, a pregnant woman. But, Raphael was on the cutting edge and, of course, did some, very creative things. We're not sure who she is. She could be a member of the Buffoni family, or she could be Emilia Pia da Montefeltro. The Montefeltro family, of course, were very prominent in Raphael's hometown of Urbino. And the next one is the painting known as Madonna del Granduca, which was painted in 1505. Again, shows a very strong influence to Leonardo's concept of sfumato. And each of these paintings, to me, is kind of very, very special. They're very realistic. They express very human emotions, and they're all very, very, I just find them fascinating. And these are the ones that I focused on when I was at the Pitti Palace. And this very last painting that you're looking at is the painting of Julius II. I wasn't sure that this painting was in the Pitti Palace, but when I saw it, I said, wow, Raphael has this one in there as well. And, Julius II was a great patron of Raphael's, and he did the portrait. It turns out this is not a Raphael, but it's a Titian. But Raphael did the original, and everybody kind of copied this. The actual portrait of Julius II is currently in the National Gallery of London. And that brings us to the end of the show. I hope you enjoyed that. Again, as you know now that you didn't know before, it was very, very esoteric, focused very narrowly on a particular theme of the wonderful artist Raphael. Now, I hope you really enjoyed that presentation. The next show I do will be focusing on number 131. We'll be focusing on a particular street in Florence. Now, many of you have, who have seen the show many times know that I like to focus on streets in Florence and Rome. And I find it very interesting. Once again, goes back to my theme of really creating a narrow focus on the things that I really would like to present to you. So, I'm going to be focusing on, indeed, maybe a couple of 100 feet span of the street Via della Spada. Now, you may remember I did a show on Via della Scala, where I spoke about the hotel we stay in, Lydia's leather store, Gioia Chiara's on that street, and a few other things that are really, wonderful. And that's what I'm going to pretty much do for this show. I have, I'll wait till I get to that particular show, which will be the next one. So I hope you enjoyed this show, and I hope you come back for many, many more. Until then, buonanotte e buona fortuna.